Hello, thanks, Nurjan. Yeah, hi. My name's Romain. I will be talking about what we did the past year and what we're doing the coming year for Metaflow. So this talk, I'll show you how you can use Metaflow and all these new cool AI things that you can do with LLMs and stuff. Well, not quite, but at the end of the session, Ville will be talking about how Metaflow is useful in these new domain and actually has a growing use. In this talk, though, I'll be more focusing on effectively the infra. So the infra is Metaflow, and what we aim to do with Metaflow is allow you to build cool stuff on top of it on a stable base. So what we can do, and you'll hear some of these in this talk, so you'll hear about how JDev and team are building a content knowledge graph on top of Metaflow. There's a media inference framework, not in this session, but that has been built on top of Metaflow. You'll also hear about how synopsis can get generated with Metaflow, with another talk with Gabriella. And other teams have built like model explainers. So all these things are effectively built on the stable infra that is Metaflow. Metaflow has been out since 2017 at Netflix, as 2019 in open source, and it's pretty widely used. So these are just a sample of companies that our friends at Outer Bounds gave me that have been using Metaflow. Internally at Netflix, it's also a growing use. So this is just some metrics that I am showing here. So at Netflix, we have actually a data tool called Fast Data, which if you look online, you'll see some presentations on it. And so this shows the usage of this tool. So you can see that we're kind of growing pretty fast. So 2024, this was the number of operations that were done through this tool. And based on the first 3 months of 2025, this is what I estimate for 2025. And in terms of number of flows and number of runs, also quite healthy growth. I will also say that it's being used in more domains. So we started out in the data science and engineering organization, and now it's being used for recommendation. It's being used in ads and games, et cetera. So lots of other usage within Netflix. So what did we do last year, and what are we doing this year? So I'll go through three areas. If you look at our documentation, it's also organized this way: how you can develop with Metaflow, how you can scale your development with Metaflow, and then how you can deploy with Metaflow. So in those three areas, last year, we worked on a couple of things. Real-time cards. So cards were a way to kind of visualize artifacts or any other information after the execution of your step. And Outer Bounds added dynamic cards that basically kind of update as your step is executing. So you can use progress bars, you can show metrics as your step is executing, et cetera. We did stubs and typing. This is kind of boring, I guess, but actually really helps when you're developing the code. You can get auto-completion, et cetera, et cetera. It's surprisingly difficult to do in something like Metaflow, which is a framework that's dynamically built. This one I'll talk about a little later, NB Runner, so I'll leave that for later. Also configs, I'll talk a lot about that. And then local development stack. This is new, actually, as of 2 weeks ago. You can now set up a whole Metaflow environment on your laptop, and you can basically use Argo Kubernetes directly on your laptop. In the scale, there was a lot of work in distributed training. So these are extensions. You can use MPI, you can use Ray. There's a couple of others that you can use effectively to do distributed training with Metaflow. Slurm is another one. This was actually, I think it was bug number 29 when we started. So this was a long request about how to integrate with Slurm, which is very used in HPC. Trainium, just using Trainium on AWS. Checkpoint, this allows you to basically, again, in collaboration with distributed training, if you have a long running training, you can actually kind of checkpoint your progress and resume later. In deploy, I'll talk about deployer a little later, so I'll leave that for later. And then what we're working on for next year, custom decorators, I'll also talk about that, so hold tight. Flexible packaging we'll talk about, and then spin is a way to allow you to iterate quickly on a step. So in Metaflow, the unit of computation is effectively the flow, where you start, you do your first step, you continue with the next step, et cetera, all the way to the end. Spin kind of breaks that up and allows you to quickly iterate on a single step, so you can iterate faster and develop that step and debug it much faster. The config-driven flows, I'll also talk about that with configs. Custom artifacts I'll talk about at the end. And then as part of that, we'll also revisit model and checkpoint, which were developed initially, as like I said, to checkpoint your progress with basically the new implementation of custom artifacts. And then Metaflow functions, there'll be a full talk on that at the end as well. This is a pretty cool feature, so I won't spoil it. You might have heard in the previous slide, I mentioned that some of the stuff like Ray or checkpoints are extensions. So what are Metaflow extensions? Well, Metaflow is actually built around a core system that provides a bunch of functionality around environment management, metadata, that's how we keep track of what's running, data visualization, like cards, compute, like batch, etc., debugging capabilities, schedulers like Argo, and things like that. But you can kind of customize it to your needs, and that's what we do at Netflix. We don't use Argo step functions or Airflow. We have something called Maestro, and so we customize Metaflow to, instead of having Argo, Airflow, and step functions, we have our users use Maestro. And we do the same thing with compute. We don't use Kubernetes or batch. We use something called Titus. And so our users effectively use Titus. Other companies do this as well. They basically customize it to their needs. We have the same thing for environments. We have our own environment management, which is available as an extension in open source as well. And we have Fast Data, which is the tool I was mentioning that is not in open source, to manage data. We also provide whole new functionality like hosting, which is our inference service on top of Metaflow. So this is great, and it allows you to kind of customize Metaflow to whatever you want to do, but it is kind of heavyweight, and it's not well supported. Let's just say it's not officially supported, although it works just fine. People have been asking, okay, I just actually want to extend Metaflow a little bit by including my own code, including my own Python decorators. So how do I do that? And so we are now releasing this year, coming soon, probably this quarter, flexible packaging. And to answer something like this, we're trying to add a custom step decorator to emit some flow metrics. For example, just want to capture how long a step takes. Now, this is pretty easy in Python. You could just slap a decorator on top of it and say, start time, etc., and that would be great. But it's complicated if you want to do it in a way that your users can kind of use easily without having to install this package that you want, or they have to include a file. So it's not really convenient. So we're introducing this. You can effectively just write a package, as my utility package. All you have to do is have this Metaflow package variable at the top somewhere, and say, okay, I want this timing wrapper to be in there. And then in Metaflow, you can use timing directly on your step. So this looks very unassuming and pretty easy, but the hidden difficulty here is that you can also see the Kubernetes decorator, which means that this will not run on the machine that this is on. What Metaflow is doing behind the scene here is actually looking at all the packages that include this Metaflow package, packaging them for you, including them in the code package that it sends over to Kubernetes so that it's available over there. And so this effectively allows you to very quickly include other utilitarian code in your Metaflow flow. This is coming up. You'll see these little tags of things that are actually available now if you download the code, and things that will be available a little later. So to recap a little bit about the difference between extensions and the packaging that I just talked about. So in flexible packaging, so in Metaflow, we already package Metaflow, and we already package your code. We already packaged also the environment. So this is all the PyPy and Conda dependencies that you have so that you can replicate your environment remotely. What we're adding here is that you are effectively able to add other packages that are not necessarily part of your user code, and send them over to be remotely executed. Metaflow extensions look a little different. So same thing, Metaflow is packaged, and we also kind of include other extensions inside Metaflow that you can define as a company, like in our case, the Maestro workflow, for example. And then the rest stays the same. And you can combine both of these together naturally, so you can have extensions and user packages. The first approach, the flexible packaging, is really meant for the end data scientist or the end user, or potentially some a platform owner, but pretty lightweight. The second one, the Metaflow extensions, is the most flexible approach. You can pretty much do anything you want. It's much heavier, and it's meant to be much more deeply integrated with the Metaflow runtime. It's not meant for the data scientist. It's not meant for the end user, and it's also not officially supported. The first one will be, and will be something that we will support going forward. just before moving on, I want to make a quick intermission about our philosophy in developing Metaflow. So Metaflow provides a lot of pieces, and we want them to fit not like a puzzle where you can't really figure out how the pieces kind of fit together unless you really spend a lot of time, but more like Legos. Now, this is AI generated, so the Legos are kind of a little iffy, but you get the idea that they're supposed to kind of all come together. The infrastructure should fit like Legos. All the blocks should kind of intuitively kind of work together and provide more functionality than their individual pieces. And so taking that, so you saw the packaging before, we also have custom decorators that I mentioned that we're developing. So the user came back and said, okay, that approach with the time is not great because I don't want the user to have to write @timing every time. Oh, someone's clicking. I don't want the user to have to write @timing every time on the flow. So how do I fix that? Well, this is our solution, again, coming up probably in the next couple of weeks. You can have a custom flow decorator that says @timing, and then you can say, okay, for every step in my flow, I want to add this wrapper, the timing wrapper that you can see above, which is a version of what you saw before, which does the same thing, computes the start time, runs the flow, and measures the duration. You can define your own flow spec that says, hey, it's the same thing as a flow spec, except now it has @timing, and then the user just writes this. There's no timing in there, but automatically they will get the timing code in here. So this is coming also this quarter. Moving on a little bit about the deployment lifecycle for the users. So deployment goes, you develop, then you execute, you validate, you make some progress, and you repeat. This is effectively spin. So I won't be talking too much about that. This is what I had talked about before, that we are going to make it easier to do this cycle on a single step. But once you've done that, you want to productize your flow. So usually you want to run through some CI/CD pipeline. You want to take your flow, you want to run some tests, and potentially also deploy it with certain configurations so you can deploy multiple of them. So for example, you want to say, okay, I want to deploy a flow for this metric, and then I want to deploy another one that does almost the same thing, but it targets this other metric. And so they're all the same. So ideally, you would like to manage all of this through CI/CD pipeline. This has been hard to do in the past in Metaflow, and we did release configs and with runner, and you can see how effectively this makes it much easier. So here we start with just runner. So you can see how you can basically run tests with this runner with just a PyTest thing, and you just say, okay, I want to run all these flows that I have, run them, and just make sure that they have an OK artifact, for example. So this makes it really easy to run tests in your CI/CD pipeline. You can do more. I know I said I wouldn't talk about spin, but you can see that the same thing applies with spin here. You can say, okay, instead of running my whole flow and checking, I want to run each individual step in my flow and check it. The same syntax applies, runner.spin instead of runner.run, and you can check whether or not the step ran properly. Again, here you can see that the pieces all fit together. Spin kind of works with runner and kind of works with deployer as well. So here, this is once you're deploying. So now you've effectively ran your test. You want to deploy your flows. You can deploy them. We use Maestro, but the same concept applies with Argo and step functions, where you can just basically do deployer.argo workflows, create. Now, if you add what we talked about before with configurations, you can do something like this, where you effectively have a bunch of configurations in your flow, and you can say, I'm going to just deploy all of these flows with different configuration values, and you can tie it with something like Hydra that can generate all these configurations for you. This pattern is actually used within Netflix, not using Hydra, but a similar system, where the users are deploying multiple flows at once using this exact pattern. A note on configs. I just want to know about the difference between configs, parameters, and artifacts that we've been working with in Metaflow. So you have 3 stages when you're executing a flow. The deployment, which is when you're actually kind of like saying, okay, I'm going to run this. Then you actually run it. So it's easier to think about if you're an Argo workflow. When you deploy to Argo workflow, it's a deployment. When you actually trigger a run, you run. And when it's running, it's the execution. And at different stages, you can have these values that are effective. So configs are effectively frozen in place at deploy time. That means that you can use them in decorators and step code, and they're constants. Parameters are at runtime. They're fixed at runtime when you start running. That means you can't use them in decorators because by then the decorators have already been frozen in time when you're, for example, deploying to Argo. So you can use them in the step code as constants. And then when you're executing, you have artifacts, which are during step codes, and you can use those as values. So each of these values or types of values has a different role. At the end, they're all saved as artifacts, so you can always view them, but they are basically frozen in time at different times. The configs really look simple, but we have big plans for them. One of them is this. You can see that with the config here and the custom decorator that we had talked about earlier, now you can effectively add decorators to your steps based on a configuration. So for example, you can say, hey, I'm in a deployment, a production deployment, so I want to run everything on Kubernetes. So you add all your Kubernetes deployment decorators based on that. Or no, I'm just locally testing. I don't need the Kubernetes decorator. So you can basically modify your flow kind of dynamically like this. This is in beta. It's in beta in the sense that it hasn't been documented, but it does work. Last thing I want to cover, custom artifacts. I'll go quickly for this. Not too much to say, but we get comments like this, like my job is ooming at the end, or I'm trying to use Metaflow and this weird underlying bug. What happens is that Metaflow will pickle all the artifacts, and that's not always great, not always desirable or efficient. Certain things don't pickle well, certain things take a lot of space to pickle, the ooming, and we want to solve this. So we're going to define custom artifacts, which allow extension writers to define custom serializers and deserializers, to define higher level abstractions. Then you can define like a TensorFlow model that will have its own serializer, deserializer, et cetera. So this is still a work in progress, so not too much to say here. Last thing I wanted to say and take away is that Metaflow aims to be kind of the stable road that takes you to the next big thing. So the next big thing, you know, that we all hear about, what's the current one? Manus? Okay. So the next big thing, Metaflow can help you get there. We don't aim to be the next big thing in some sense, but we aim to be the stable infrastructure that allows you to go there. Thank you, and that's all. I have a few minutes for questions. If anyone has questions, there's mics there. Thank you.